Hello friends, this is Gopi. Welcome to our YouTube channel. This is the third session and today we can see the training topic cybersecurity in pre-sales. Here you can learn how to create the security proposals or security RFP RFI response for the application or product. Also the training will describe what are all the security considerations you need to do when create any security proposals or any security RFP RFI response in the pre-sales. Let's go to the topic now. Okay, agenda, terminologies which is related to pre-sales, pre-sales overview, security consideration in pre-sales, sample web application, and we can see how to create the security proposals, benefit of the approaches. These aspects we can discuss today. Okay, statement of work SOW. It is an artifact or document. The seller shall describe the details to the buyer. It defines majorly project specific activities, deliverables and timelines. Typically it includes the project requirements, pricing as per the standard governance. Request for proposals RFP. It is a business proposals made by seller through the bidding process to buyer. It describes the project specific activities, deliverables and timelines. Typically it includes the project requirements, pricing, etc. Okay, RFP response. It is a document the seller shall describe and provide a response to the buyer's RFP with required inputs such as scope, not in scope of the work, activities, deliverables to be followed in the project. Request for information RFI. Here buyer seeks to understand the capability of seller. RFI response. Seller shall send the response to the buyer's RFI with required inputs such as capabilities, competencies, skill set, etc. Request for quotation. The document the buyer published to the seller with price quote per item. FDA, Food and Drug Administration. NVD, National Vulnerability Database. These terminologies I will use in this session when I present the security consideration in pre-sales. Okay, pre-sales overview. Pre-sales is a process and activity in SDLC in the earlier stage. It describes the scope and not in scope of the work. It describes the list of activities and deliverables of the project. The pre-sales deliverables is SOW, RFP response, RFI response, etc. Current challenge in pre-sales. Security consideration not happening properly, maybe timeline, tools, cost, infrastructure aspect for the security activities. Minimal sources and references to get security in pre-sales awareness. That is why the course will provide what are all the security we need to consider when we create the security proposals. Okay, security consideration in pre-sales. When we create the SOW, RFI, RFP response, how we need to consider the security activities. That angle we can see. Security scope and not in scope of the project. Identify the security activities, deliverables and receivables. Security timeline, tools, cost, security tools and infrastructure aspects, resource skill set, if need we can add, security standards, external security compliance or regulatory compliance if required. So these considerations majorly we need to do when we create the proposals or RFP, RFI response. Okay, here you can see a sample web application specification. Based on this specification, how we need to create the security proposals or SOW, that angle we can discuss here. So if we see the specification, application type, web application, backend components, assume that we have majorly Tomcat, Postgres and data analytics algorithms. Server side programming, assume that we are using Java. Web client programming and scripting language, AngularJS, HTML, CSS, JSON. Authentication type, assume that it is a centralized key cloud based authentication. API token, assume that the tokens authentication, authorization, session validation is happening through JWT. Assume that number of users will support 1000. Number of user groups provided by the application 4. Data handling, majorly medical related data such as EPHI, P2I, server OS. Assume that this is a Linux server OS. Deployment, it is deploying in the VM. Remote services, SSH shall support to access from remote connection. Security standards, regulatory compliance. Assume that this is a medical based application. So HIPAA and FDA we are assuming. Then the overall project cost 700 FTE to develop, test and deliver the application. So based on this specification, how we need to create the security proposals, that angle we can see in the session. Okay, before going to the execution, we will see the sample security activities reference model. I explained the reference model in the first session itself. Suppose if need more inputs, you can refer the first session. Presales is one of the preliminary assessment in the development life cycle. When we create the security proposals, what are all the security considerations we need to do? That aspect we are discussing now. Majorly the execution approaches, tools, cost, estimation, timeline for the activities, all these aspects we can discuss now. When we create any security proposals or any security RFP, RFI response, the security scope and not in scope of the security activities to be identified in the first step. Here, the end-to-end security activities are scope. So based on that, I identified the security activities and deliverables to be followed in the development life cycle. If you see in the table, the activities, deliverables and state or stage, which stage we need to do each activity. Example, presales proposals. Here we need to do in the logical stage only. Then the security requirements, cyber security risk management plan, threat modeling, risk assessment, threat modeling and security risk analysis, secure architecture and secure design principles, privacy impact assessment, software hazard analysis, secure coding guidelines and secure code review guidelines. Up to the 7th item we need to do in the logical stage itself. The secure coding guidelines and secure code review we need to do in the development stage. So that is why the static stage I mentioned here. The next task, SAST, DAST, penetration test, first test, security hardening, these activities also I considered. Suppose if we have more scope on the vulnerability management, continuous monitoring, patch management in the post-production activity, you can describe that activities also. Now the security activities are identified here. Based on each activity, how much timeline it will take. Timeline we need to identify in next step. Based on our security scope, the list of security activities are identified and it is mentioned in the first column. The second column, tentative timeline in days, it is mentioned. This is FTE. The cyber security requirements here considered for 5 days. It includes the cyber security requirement preparation, review and finalizing the requirement. Cyber security risk management plan. It includes plan preparation, review, finalization. Secure component selection. Here the secure component selection 3 days. Threat modeling and security risk analysis 5 days. Security architecture and design principles guideline creation, review, finalization 5 days. Privacy impact assessment 3 days. Software hazard analysis 3 days. Secure coding guidelines 3 days. Secure coding implementation and review 10 days. SAST, static application security test and report review 3 days. Dynamic application security test and report review 2 days. Penetration testing 15 days. First testing 10 days. Security bug fix and retest 15 days. This is the tentative timeline considered each activities to execute and deliver the activity. Other activities, hardening and post-production activities, if any assume that we have some post-production activity, maybe the secure configuration, vulnerability scanning, vulnerability management. I considered 5 days. Any regulatory compliance activity supports if need. I assumed this is need, so 5 days. If we calculate all the timeline value, it is coming to 100 days. So these 100 days we need to work for security activities, execution, deliverables, all the aspects. The overall project cost is given 700 FTE. Security activities we planned 100 FTE. Suppose if we convert in the percentage of FTE for security activities, around 14.2% we are spending for security. Okay, always the best practice when we do the end-to-end security activities and support, it is recommended 15 to 20% of the overall project cost we need to spend for the security. So end-to-end security activities we need to consider and we need to do thoroughly. That is why the 15 to 20% average we can consider. Sometimes it may vary, sometimes it may below 15 or above 20 may also scenarios are there when we do the new product development. This is one of the sample calculation. We can do this calculation whenever we do the security proposals and we can recheck whether we identified proper security estimation for the application or solution. This is weekly execution plan for the security activity. We can use any project management tool and we can create the graph. List of security activities which is identified in the earlier stage I mentioned in this column, and weekly wise, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, the weekly wise. If required we can create this type of graph and we can refer further with our SOW. Okay, another important consideration, security tools and cost. So tools list are mentioned in the first column. The second column, whether this is open source or license. Third column, if it is license, what is the cost? Then the purpose of the tool. So all these aspects we need to consider and we need to create the cost sheet for each tool. Example, the Microsoft threat model is open source and the purpose of the tool, threat model execution. Veracode, this is license. We need to consider the Veracode cost from the vendor or internet and we need to update in the sheet. The purpose of the tool to execute the SAST scanning. Bubsuit professional license we need, cost we need to update in the column. Purpose of the tool, DAST and penetration testing tool. Nessus professional, this is also license. We need to consider the cost. The purpose of the Nessus tool, vulnerability scanning tool, right? Then OWASP ZAP, this is open source. Nmap open source. Kali Linux tools also open source. So the purpose of the tools also I mentioned here. Defensic, this is license and we need to consider the cost. The Defensic is first testing for APIs. Then the Oracle VirtualBox also we need sometimes. So this is open source, no cost is involved here. And purpose of the tool also mentioned here. So this is the sample. Whenever we consider the license tools, the cost details also we need to consider for each tool. And we need to check whether the tool's license cost is handling by the customer or the project development team shall handle the cost. All this aspect we need to discuss with the proposals. Okay, when we create the security proposals, we need to consider the infrastructure requirements also for the security activities execution. Example, the infrastructure here we considered VM with 32 GB RAM with latest processor. The purpose of the mission, penetration test execution, SAST execution, first test execution. Quantity here mentioned 1. Windows OS, penetration test mission, SAST, first test execution, quantity 1. Kali Linux, quantity 1. VM with 32 GB RAM. This is for application and DB installation. So the quantity is 2. So this is the sample infrastructure and OS details we considered for these proposals. Okay, next is resources. Resources role, number of resources. qualification or profile stage. Sometimes this is band or grade. We can mention if required. Utilization, percentage of utilization for the project. Responsibilities. So the resource responsibility also we need to identify when we create the security proposals. This is the sample resource identification which we identified for these proposals. Example, resource role, number of resources, profile stage or band or grade, utilization, responsibilities. The first resource, security manager. Here one, profile stage, maybe profile stage if required we can mention here. Utilization, how much utilization he want work for the application. 25% is sufficient to work for the application to execute risk management plan, security deliverables. Security architect, number of resources 1, utilization 50%. He can create the security requirements, threat model, risk assessment, secure design and architecture. That aspect he can create. Then secure developer, 3 members. Profile stage, if required we can mention 100%. Security developers, bug fix, report analysis. This aspect he can work. Penetration tester 100%. Penetration test and first test execution. When we create the security proposals, the resource identification also one of the important input we need to consider that. Okay, execution approaches if need we can include. Suppose if customers or any audience ask how we will execute, what outcome we can get from the assessment, what benefit each assessment we can get. Suppose if we get that sort of clarifications, we can derive some high level approach and we can give high level inputs how we will execute and what outcome and benefits we can achieve. All this aspect we can give. Example I given here, the threat model and risk assessment execution approach I given here. Step 1, data identification, asset identification we will do. Step 2, architecture understanding, data flow diagrams creation, workflow diagrams understanding, Microsoft threat model based threat identification. Step 3, decompose the application, attack entry points, cybersecurity bill of materials, external dependencies. Step 4, threat agent identification, attack surface, threat classification with the stride mapping. Step 5, security controls identification, pre-risk rate, post-risk rate, residual risk. Step 6, security requirements, updates and security implementation to mitigate the identified threats. The outcome of the assessment, all possible threats we can identify, required security controls we can identify, risk assessment, pre-risk, post-risk, residual risk we can create, updated security requirements we can do, gap fulfillment for the threat identification we can do it here. Benefits, identify all possible threats at the earlier stage, that is one benefit. Accordingly we can plan for further mitigation, proper mitigation to mitigate the identified threats, security requirements we can update. So these are all the benefits we can get when do the threat model and the risk assessment. This is the high level input. When I explain the threat model in separate section, I will deep dive in each step and I will give more explanation there. So whenever we get any request to provide execution approaches, these sort of input we can provide. And this is the threat model and risk assessment execution approaches. Okay, next sample I given penetration test execution approach. The step 1, data and asset identification we will do, understanding the scope and not in scope of the penetration test, test plan creation and test cases preparation we will do. In the step 2, infrastructure preparation, tools installation we will do. Step 3, vulnerability scan, port scan, dry run, test cases updates, finding consolidation we will do. Step 4, risk rate, calculation, remediation, report preparation we will do. Step 5, create the security issues in tracking tools such as Jira, bug fix, retest, security requirements updates. So these aspects we will do. The outcome of the penetration test execution, penetration test plan we can create, penetration test cases we can create, penetration test findings, risk rate and report, bug fix, retest, update the security requirements based on the findings. Benefits: in-depth testing and identify all possible runtime related vulnerabilities, bug fix, retest, we can make it here. This is the high level approach for the penetration test execution. So other security activities also we can create this type of security execution approaches, and we can explain to customers or audience whenever is required. Anyway, these approaches are optional only for the proposals. That is why if required, we can create these sort of inputs. Otherwise, we can ignore the execution approach section. Okay, next section is security standards. When we create the security proposals, we need to mention somewhere what are all the security standards we are following and we are executing the activities. Example, this is the web application project. So OWASP top 10 SANS CWE security requirements we will follow and we will execute the security activities. Meantime, the CVE NVD database we will use for the secure component selection. Microsoft threat model ARM practices we will use for the threat model practices. CVSS calculator we will use for risk rating. CSET OWASP secure coding we will follow for secure coding practices. HIPAA, FDA, P2I regulatory compliance we will follow to achieve the regulatory related compliance or requirements. So this is the sample security standards for the application. So whenever we need the security standards based on the application, we can create the security standards and we can follow these standards, requirements and guidelines. When we create the proposals, the assumption and risk details also we need to note in the proposal sheet. Example, the assumptions here we can mention like application end-to-end security is considered as a scope. Application shall follow security standards, OWASP top 10 SANS CWE and NIST. Application shall other CSET OWASP secure coding practices. Risk, if we have any risk, example, if we have any gaps on the security requirements or security activities, security deliverables or tools, cost, infrastructure, that risk we can note it down here so that the earlier stage itself we can identify the risk. We can plan to mitigate that risk further when we discuss with the customer or any external stakeholders. Okay, once we complete the security proposals, we can create an internal checklist and we can verify all the inputs are considered properly. Example, this is the checklist I created for these proposals. This is the item number and this is the checklist details. We will take the first item checklist, check whether the project requirements are understood properly. Suppose if we have any gaps on the understanding, we can get details from the customers or stakeholders and we can update the proposals accordingly. Check the scope and not in scope security details are mentioned properly. If we have any gaps on the scope and not in scope, we can update accordingly. Check the security activities, deliverables and receivables are defined properly based on the scope. Check the execution timeline is considered and calculated properly. Check the security tools and infrastructure is identified properly. Check the security execution approaches are mentioned. If required, we can mention, otherwise we don't want to include the security execution approaches. That is why I mentioned this is optional only. Check the security standards and the regulatory standards are considered properly. Check the assumption are noted in the proposals. Check the risk details are mentioned. If it is applicable, we can mention the risk. In the sample proposals, I didn't mention any security risk since currently we don't have any risk identified here. Check the resource and skill set are mentioned properly. So these sort of security checklist you can create, and you can verify whether all the inputs are updated in the proposals when you finalize your proposals. Okay, next, applicability for different development scenarios. The security proposals and approaches shall follow for all types of product development scenarios. Example, the application development, mobile application development, embedded development, IoT, cloud-based solutions. So all the development area, this proposal creation is applicable whenever we need. So we can use this approach and we can create the security proposals as part of our pre-sales activity. Benefits. Suppose if we create proper security proposals in the pre-sales, what benefit we can achieve? Security scope and not in scope shall define in the earlier stage. Suppose if we have any security gaps or risk, it can be identified in the earlier stage. Identified security, timeline, tools, infrastructure, resource, and we can plan accordingly. It helps to achieve end-to-end security for the applications or product, and it helps to prevent from the hacking, security breaches in the production. This helps for the application or product to other any security compliance. Okay, next session I will take a web application and I will create end-to-end security requirements. Meantime, what are all the considerations we need to do when we create the security requirements? All this aspect we can deep dive and we can discuss in next session. I done the training session for this topic. Suppose if need, you can take any sample application development scenarios and you can try to create security proposals. Suppose if need any clarifications on this topic, please post the clarifications in comment section. I will see you in next session. Bye.